The cup is bronze. The metal inside it glows. In a tent somewhere east of the Euphrates, in the 3rd week of June, in the year 53 before Christ, a Parthian officer steps forward, holding the cup with a pair of tongs. The man on the ground in front of him is dead, or nearly. He has been the richest man in the city of Rome for 30 years. He has lent money to half the Senate. He has owned the houses that burned and bought them while they were still burning. He has crucified 6,000 slaves along the Appian Way in a single afternoon. He has just turned 62. His name is Marcus Licinius Crassus. The officer pours. The gold runs into the mouth that argued for this war in the Senate. The witnesses are silent. Florus, writing more than a century later, will give the moment a single sentence, so clean it sounds like a sentence of court. They poured molten gold down his throat, mocking his thirst for the metal. The line is too good to be entirely true. Florus is condensing what was already a legend by the time he wrote. But the legend was built on a corpse, and the corpse was real. A few days earlier, on the open plain south of a town the Romans called Carrhae and the locals called Harran, 20,000 Roman legionaries had died in a single afternoon and the morning after. 10,000 more had been taken prisoner and walked east into the silver mines of Margiana. 7 aquilae, the silver or gold eagles that were the soul of 7 legions, had been carried off as trophies. 3 Roman generals, including the consul's own son, were dead in the dust. And Serena, the 30-something head of the Parthian house of Cyrene, the man who had won the battle by understanding 2 things the Romans did not, was about to send Crassus's head 1,500 kilometers east to a wedding feast where it would be used as a stage prop in a Greek-language performance of Euripides. This is the story of how the wealthiest politician in the Roman Republic walked an army across the Mesopotamian desert in the wrong season, ignored every warning he was given, and put the question to Rome that it could not answer for the next 270 years. Where exactly does the empire end? Plutarch, in his Life of Crassus, written in the early 2nd century, devotes more space to this campaign than to almost any other event in his vast biographical project. The disaster at Carrhae was the first time a Roman field army at full strength, with consular leadership, was destroyed in open battle by an enemy with no city the Romans could march on and no senate they could bribe. The Parthians did not fight on Roman terms. They did not have to. Plutarch's main source on the ground was almost certainly the memoir of a Roman officer named Gaius Cassius Longinus, the same Cassius who would put a knife into Julius Caesar 9 years later in the Senate House. Cassius survived Carrhae. Cassius wrote about it, and Cassius had every reason to make Crassus look worse than he was. I read this passage 3 times before I noticed what Plutarch isn't doing. He never names the source. Cassius Dio, writing a century later, used a different stream, more sympathetic to the Senate as an institution and less sympathetic to Crassus as a man. The 2 accounts disagree on details that matter. They agree on the ending. The ending is the cup. Before we go further, a word about the period this story is sitting in. This is the late Roman Republic, the last generation before the civil wars that will produce Augustus. The triumvirate of Crassus, Pompey the Great, and Julius Caesar is 3 years old. Caesar is in Gaul, slaughtering Eburones in the forests of the Ardennes and writing the dispatches that will become his commentaries. Pompey is in Rome, theatrically governing Spain through subordinates from a villa on the Alban Hills. Crassus has been given the eastern half of the empire as his pro-consular province, Syria and whatever lies beyond it. He is 62. He has been the 2nd richest man in Roman politics for his entire adult life. He has watched Pompey ride 3 triumphs through the Forum, while he, Crassus, was given a paltry ovation for cleaning up the Spartacus revolt. He wants a triumph of his own. He has decided that Parthia will give him one. To understand what happened at Carrhae, you have to understand what Parthia actually was, and how badly the Roman political class had managed not to understand it for the previous 80 years. The Parthian Empire in 53 BC stretched from the Euphrates to the Hindu Kush, from the Caspian shore down to the Persian Gulf, the largest single state on the Eurasian landmass between China and Rome. Founded a century and a half earlier by a clan of Iranian horse nomads called the Pani, it had slowly turned itself into the heirs of the Achaemenid Persians. The King of Kings, the Arsacid, ruled through a federation of 7 great hereditary houses. Each held a province, each could raise its own private army. The King of Kings, when he went to war, marched at the head of whatever each of these houses chose to send him. The greatest of the 7, in the summer of 53, was the House of Suren. Its head was the young man the Greeks and Romans called simply Surena, which was not his name but his title, the House Lord of Suren, the Suren. His given name is lost. Plutarch, who had the best access to the sources of any ancient writer on this period, never bothered to record it. By Plutarch's count, he was about 30 years old at Carrhae. By his own family's count, he was somewhere between 28 and 33. The Eastern sources count differently. He was the 3rd-ranking man in the Parthian state, behind only the King of Kings and the king's brother. He had 10,000 horsemen of his own clan, and he had, 2 years before, personally placed Orodes II on the Parthian throne after a civil war that killed Orodes' brother, Mithridates IV, at the gates of Babylon. That last fact will matter at the end of this story. Orodes was on the throne because Surena had put him there. In the Parthian system, where every great house was a potential rival to every other, the King of Kings sat on a chair with 7 legs, and any one of them could be sawn off in a year. Rome had been bumping into Parthia in a half-curious, half-aggressive way for 80 years. Sulla, Lucullus, and Pompey had each in turn rolled up to the Euphrates, looked across it, and decided the river was a sensible eastern limit. Pompey had signed a treaty with the previous Parthian king, Phraates III, that made the Euphrates the formal boundary. Phraates was poisoned by his own sons in 57 BC. One of the sons was Orodes, the other was Mithridates IV. The civil war between them was the war that brought Surena onto the political map. When Crassus arrived in Syria in late 54 BC, the Roman intelligence picture of Parthia was, by the standards of any serious imperial power, embarrassing. The standard Roman expectation, by the modern historian Gareth Sampson's reading of the sources, was that the Parthians would fight more or less like the army of Mithridates of Pontus, a phalanx of Greek-style heavy infantry stiffened by some cavalry, vulnerable to legionary discipline. The men around Crassus did not know about the cataphracts. They did not know about the Parthian shot. They did not know about the camel trains of spare arrows. They did not know about the open plain south of Carrhae, where there would be nowhere to hide and nothing to hold. There is one passage in Plutarch that haunts me every time I come back to this period. As Crassus prepared to leave Italy in late 55, the tribune Ateius Capito met him at the gates of Rome with a brazier of incense. He set it across Crassus's path, poured wine into it, and called down, by name, the most ancient curses in the Roman religious vocabulary. Formulas the priests warned were not to be used except when the city itself was in mortal danger. The crowd at the gate fell silent. Crassus walked through the smoke without stopping. He sailed in winter against the advice of his pilots. He lost ships in a storm. To understand what happened at Carrhae, you have to understand the man who walked through that smoke. And to understand him, you have to go back another 20 years, to the night the slaves came down from Vesuvius. In 73 BC, 200 gladiators broke out of a training school in Capua under the Thracian Spartacus. Within a year they had destroyed 2 Roman consular armies and a Praetorian one. No senator of consular rank was willing to take the command. The man who did was the praetor of that year, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the only man in the city ambitious enough and rich enough to absorb the political cost of fighting slaves. Crassus put the war back together in 7 months. He raised 6 legions at his own expense. When 2 of his cohorts broke and ran, he decimated them. 500 men picked by lot, clubbed to death in front of the rest of the army. The punishment had not been used in living memory. He drove Spartacus into the toe of Italy, sealed the peninsula behind a 40-mile siege wall, and forced the final battle on the river Silarus in early 71. 6,000 prisoners were crucified along the Via Appia from Capua to Rome. By Appian's count, 1 cross every 35 meters for 200 kilometers. The Senate gave him an ovation, not a triumph. Pompey, arriving at the end with his Spanish veterans, got the triumph. Crassus, looking on, would never forget it. By Pliny the Elder, in Book 33 of the Natural History, Crassus owned almost every block worth owning inside the city of Rome. His fire brigade of 500 slaves would arrive at burning tenements and offer to buy the property on the spot. If the owner agreed, the brigade put out the fire. If not, it watched the building burn. The 70 million sesterces he had inherited from his father became, by the year he set out for Syria, somewhere between 100 and 200 million. By the lower estimate, his personal fortune at 62 was roughly equal to the annual revenue of the entire Roman state. He had bought his way into the triumvirate. He had paid down Caesar's debts to make the consulship of 59 possible. He had brokered the renewal at Lucca in 56 that gave Caesar Gaul, Pompey Spain, and himself Syria. He departed Rome in November 55 without waiting for spring, walked through the smoke of Aetius Capito's brazier. By Cicero in a letter to Atticus, the curses were the devotio, and sailed in winter for Brundisium. The campaign of 54 was a sort of dress rehearsal. Crassus crossed the Euphrates at Zeugma with 7 legions, took a dozen Greek-speaking cities of northern Mesopotamia, garrisoned them, and pulled the bulk of his army back to winter in Syria. He could have wintered east of the river, closer to his targets. He chose not to. By Plutarch and Cassius Dio both, the reason was that Crassus wanted to spend the winter in Antioch collecting cash. He stripped the temple of Atargatis at Hierapolis Bambyce. By Josephus's Antiquities, he also stopped at the temple in Jerusalem and took 10,000 talents, 2,000 in coin, 8,000 as a single golden beam from the holy place, which he had ordered melted down. The molten gold of the cold open is not a Parthian invention. It is a Parthian punchline answering a Roman setup that Crassus had written himself. His son Publius joined him at Antioch in early 53. Publius was about 30 by Caesar's own commentaries. He had served 2.5 years with Caesar in Gaul, where he had commanded the cavalry at the battle on the Sambre in 57. Caesar had given him 1,000 Gallic horse to take east as a personal gift to his father, the gesture of a man who liked Crassus, owed him money, and wanted the alliance intact. The Gallic cavalry are about to matter. Hold them in mind. The Armenian king Artavasdes II joined Crassus at Antioch in the same weeks. He was a Greek speaker, the author of plays in Greek that, by Plutarch's own admission, were considered respectable in the Hellenistic literary world. He came to Crassus with a proposal the kind a serious staff officer remembers for the rest of his career. Artavasdes offered 6,000 of his own household cavalry on the spot, and a further 30,000 foot and 10,000 horse from the Armenian standing army, provided Crassus agreed to march the main Roman force north through the Armenian highlands toward Media and Ecbatana. The route was longer. It would have added 2 months, but every kilometer would have been mountain country. broken ground, narrow valleys, where horse archers cannot ride circles around infantry because there are no circles to ride. Artavasdes had been fighting Parthians on his own frontier for 15 years. He was telling Crassus to fight the war on ground where Surena's tactics could not function. Crassus refused. By Plutarch, his stated reason was that the garrisons he had left in Mesopotamia the previous summer were his line of advance. By Cassius Dio, the reason was simpler. If Crassus marched through Armenia, the triumph he wanted in Rome would be a joint one with Artavasdes. The flat road across Mesopotamia was the road to a sole triumph. Artavasdes left Antioch and took his army home. When the Parthian counter-invasion of Armenia came that summer, led by Orodes II in person, while Surena dealt with Crassus on the southern road, every Armenian soldier was on his own border, defending his own kingdom. The Roman field army was now alone on the plain. Crassus crossed the Euphrates at Zeugma in the second week of May, 53. By Plutarch's count, the 7 legions were under strength after the previous year's garrisons. About 34,000 legionaries, 4,000 light infantry, and 4,000 cavalry, of whom the 1,000 Gallic horse of Publius were the best. An unseasonable storm hit the crossing. Thunder, hail, the bridge of boats partly torn loose. When Crassus rose to address the army on the eastern bank, a sacrificial offering was knocked out of his hands, and the intestines fell to the ground. He smiled, by Plutarch, and said, quote 1, "The army heard the line, the army did not laugh." His quaestor Cassius Longinus came to him at the council that evening with the proposal every modern military historian, Sampson, Goldsworthy, Bevar, agrees would have saved the army. Keep the Euphrates on the right, march down the river, refill the water skins from the river itself, keep the garrisoned cities of Mesopotamia on the left. The river would protect one flank, the cities the other. The army would arrive at Seleucia on the Tigris with its supply line intact and its cavalry fresh. There would be no open plain. There would be no horse archers wheeling round its rear. Crassus, by Plutarch, said he would think about it. Then a man rode into the camp who would think for him. His name in the Western sources is Ariamnes. In some manuscripts of Plutarch, he is called Abgarus, which has caused 2 centuries of scholarly argument about whether he was actually Abgar II of Edessa or a separate Arab chieftain. The manuscripts disagree on the name, they agree on the role. Ariamnes was an Arab cavalry commander who had served under Pompey and was nominally a Roman ally. He arrived at Crassus's camp on the Euphrates, was given a private audience, and proceeded to tell the consul a story about the Parthians. The story was this: Orodes was running. Surena, with a token force, was withdrawing into the heart of Mesopotamia. The Parthian king was concentrating his army in the north against the Armenians. If Crassus stayed on the river, he would walk into empty country for 40 days and find nothing to fight. If Crassus instead turned away from the river and cut southeast across the open country toward the upper waters of the Belik, he would catch Surena's column before it could withdraw. The decision must be made within hours, not days. The Parthians moved fast on open ground. Plutarch is convinced Ariamnes was a Parthian agent the whole time. Cassius Dio is less sure. The modern reading, and Sampson lays it out in detail, is that Ariamnes was probably acting for himself, hoping to be paid by whichever side won, but feeding Crassus information that came from Surena's own headquarters because Surena had paid him to do it. The story he told was a baited hook. The hook was the size of Surena. The river of 40 days of empty road was the bait. Crassus took the bait. He turned the army away from the Euphrates and marched southeast into the dust country toward the Belik, against the explicit recommendation of his quaestor and the geographical sense of every centurion in the army. He did it because a man he had every reason to distrust told him that if he moved quickly, he could catch a smaller force in retreat and bring it to battle alone. If you've come this far into the history of an old man's last campaign, this is the work this channel does. The chronicles, the maps, the small decisions that lost provinces. There is more of it on the channel. Back to the column on the Bellic before noon. The army marched for 2 days into country that, by Plutarch, had no village, no river, and no shade. The wells were dry. By Cassius Dio, Serena's outriders had been filling them with sand for a week. On the 3rd day, scouts from the head of the column returned with shields full of arrows. They had counted nothing but cavalry, no infantry, no baggage, no supply train, and behind it, on the horizon, a slow-moving train of camels. Cassius rode up to Crassus and asked, by Plutarch, what the formation of the line should be. Crassus first ordered an extended single line. Then he changed his mind and ordered the army into a hollow square, 12 cohorts to a side, the cavalry inside, the baggage in the middle. It was the textbook formation for a march under cavalry threat. It was also, on a hot day in the Mesopotamian dust, with no water and no flank to anchor, a slowly tightening trap that turned the army into a single target the Parthian arrows could not miss. The army moved forward into the dust. The afternoon was the hottest of the year. Somewhere ahead, beyond the heat haze, Serena was waiting on a rise of ground the Romans could not yet see. Behind his line stood the 1,000 camels, enough spare arrows on each to keep a Parthian horse archer firing all day. Plutarch does not tell us what Crassus said in the last hour before contact. He may not have known. He may have chosen not to write it. What we have is the silence of the chronicle, and the dust, and the sound, by Cassius Dio's one specific sensory detail in this part of Book 40, of the Parthian kettle drums starting up from beyond the haze. They beat low and continuous, with little bells on the rims that the desert wind carried farther than seemed possible. The legionaries in the square heard them before they saw anything else. Then the dust on the rise opened, and the cataphracts came down. They came down the rise covered. By Plutarch, the cataphracts had thrown rough cloth over the iron scale of their cuirasses as they approached, so that the legionaries in the square would not see, until the last moment, what they were facing. Then the cloth came off. The Mesopotamian sun struck the metal. The whole front of the Parthian line shone like a moving wall of mirrors. The kettle drums beat harder. Crassus formed up to receive a charge. The cataphracts did not charge. They opened. Out from behind them, in a line longer than the Roman front, came 9,000 horse archers. They opened fire at 30 meters of bow range, then pulled back to 50, then to 70. The Parthian composite bow, by Plutarch in chapter 24 of the Crassus, was strong enough to drive a barbed shaft through a Roman scutum and into the arm of the man holding it. The arrows came as a continuous rain, from the front, then from the flanks. Then the cataphracts moved round to the rear, and the Roman square was being shot at from every side at once. Crassus did the textbook thing. He sent the slingers and the Cretan archers out to drive the Parthian horse off with a screen of return fire. They came out at a run, threw a few volleys, and were broken in minutes. The slingers had no range to match the composite bow. The Cretans had range, but they had fewer arrows than the camel train of the enemy. They fell back inside the square. The Roman cavalry tried next, and were ridden down by the cataphracts on ground the Roman horse had thought was open. The day became a thing without shape. By Plutarch, the legionaries stood inside the closing square for 6 hours under continuous arrow fire. The shields locked over their heads in a partial testudo. But the formation required the soldier to keep his right arm raised continuously. The arm grew tired. the shield dropped. The arrow found the gap. Modern reconstructions, Bivars and Samsons, converge on a casualty rate of about 400 men per hour. That is a slow rate by ancient battle standards. It is what made the day so terrible. The legionaries had time to watch it. Publius, the consul's son, asked his father for permission to break out. He had with him the 1,000 Gallic cavalry Caesar had sent east, 300 allied horse, 500 archers, and the 8 cohorts of the front right corner, between 4,000 and 4,500 men in total by Plutarch's count. He proposed to charge the Parthian horse archers on the right flank and give the rest of the army space to disengage. Crassus, by Plutarch and Dio both, agreed. Publius went out. The Parthian horse archers withdrew before him, steadily, drawing him 2 kilometers across broken country and out of sight of the main square. When he was deep enough, the cataphracts came round his flanks, and the horse archers turned at the same moment. The 1,000 Gallic horse charged the cataphracts and died on the Parthian lances. By Plutarch in chapter 25, the lances broke through Gallic mail and through the horses behind them. The Gauls dismounted and tried to drag the Parthian riders down by gripping the legs of the cataphract horses where the armor ended. None of them got home. Publius was wounded through the hand by an arrow, could no longer hold a sword, and withdrew to a small rise with his surviving officers. He asked one of his shield-bearers, by Plutarch's account, to kill him before the Parthians arrived. The 8 cohorts on the rise were then surrounded and shot down to a man. The Parthians took Publius's head. They put it on a spear. They rode it back across the 2 kilometers to the main square, slowly, with the spear held high enough that Crassus, by Plutarch in chapter 26, could see it from a long way off. Crassus did not break. By Plutarch, he walked the line of the square in full view of his men and told them the loss was his alone and that the army must hold for him. The legionaries did not cheer. They stood. They held the line through what was left of the afternoon, and when darkness came, the Parthians, who did not fight at night by their own military convention, withdrew to the rise. This was the moment the Roman army could still have been saved. If Crassus had marched it out, in the dark, on the route Cassius had been recommending for 10 days, most of the legions could have reached friendly walls by daylight. Crassus did not march. By Plutarch in chapter 27, he was in his tent in a state the chronicle calls grief, but that any modern reader would name as shock. The army held a council without him. Cassius, as senior surviving officer, ordered a night withdrawal along the route to Carrhae. 4,000 wounded were left in the camp because they could not march. The Parthians killed them in the morning. The army reached Carrhae in fragments. Serena's column came up to the walls the next day. He did not assault. He sent envoys, asking for a parley with Crassus in person to settle the conditions of the Roman withdrawal. The surviving rank and file, by Plutarch in chapter 29, pushed Crassus toward the meeting. They no longer trusted their officers to negotiate for them. He rode out in his consular cloak. Serena rode forward to meet him. A Parthian groom led a horse forward as a gift. The Roman officers moved to hold the reins. The Parthian grooms moved to push them aside. The horse, by Plutarch, was being pushed forward to start the journey east before the Romans had agreed to it. A scuffle broke out at the bridle. Octavius, one of Crassus's legates, drew his sword. The Parthians drew theirs. Octavius was cut down. Crassus was cut down beside him. Plutarch admits in chapter 31 that nobody is able to relate the manner of his death. The head and the right hand were severed and carried east. Now the gold. The molten gold of the cold open is in Florus Book 1, chapter 46, and a related passage of Cassius Dio, Book 40. The accounts differ on who poured. Florus says a Parthian officer on the field. Dio places the scene at Orodes' court several days later. Modern scholarship is divided. Adrian Goldsworthy, in the Name of Rome, treats the molten gold detail as a literary topos, the kind of story Roman writers told about Eastern kings to make Eastern victories feel like Eastern cruelty. Gareth Sampson, in The Defeat of Rome, treats the detail as more likely than not historical, because it answers, with curt Parthian economy, the specific Roman action of stripping the temple at Hierapolis and the temple in Jerusalem to fund the campaign. I lean toward Sampson. The gold in the mouth gesture is too specific to be a generic insult. The Parthians had spies in the Roman court at Antioch. They knew where the war chest had come from. The gesture answered the chest. The head was sent east to the court of Orodes II at Artaxata in Armenia, where Orodes was that same week attending the wedding of his son to a daughter of Artavasdes, the same Artavasdes who had offered Crassus 30,000 men and the safer road. By Plutarch's last chapter of the Crassus, the wedding feast was a Greek-language symposium, and the court tragedian was performing the Bacchae of Euripides, the play in which the women of Thebes tear apart the prince Pentheus and bring his head on stage on a spear. When the tragedian came to the moment the prop head was required, a Parthian stepped forward with the actual head of Crassus wrapped in a Greek mask. The tragedian sang Agave's lament over it. The two courts laughed. By Plutarch, quote 2. The wedding went on. This is the moment the story keeps. Not the battle, not the molten gold. The Parthian court at Artaxata, watching Euripides, laughing over the head of the Roman consul. The man who had wanted a triumph, a Roman processional through the forum with prisoners and captured standards, had been given one, in the language of his own classical education, on the wrong side of the Euphrates. 7 Roman aquilae went east with the head. They were displayed in a Parthian temple at Ctesiphon for the next 33 years. The long shadow. Within 50 years of Carrhae, the Roman political class had understood that the eastern frontier was a project of management, not of conquest. Mark Antony tried in 36 BC to take the same road north Artavasdes had urged on Crassus, through Armenia toward Media, and lost a third of his army in retreat under exactly the same horse archer tactics Serena had